Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for what's going to be an amazing, enriching, and important conversation about community-based approaches to end sexual and intimate partner violence. My name is Bev Neufeld, and I'm president of PowHer New York. We are an inclusive network of over 100 organizations representing different issues, diverse communities in different parts of New York. But we come together to collaborate to attain women's economic equality. And we work for equality for people of color and gender expansive individuals. How do we do it? Systemic and social change. In 2020, the Power Network came together to look at the challenges ahead for women when we move through the recovery. We had many different solutions that we found that would be really critical for recovery. We put it together into a document called the Roadmap for Inclusive Gender Justice in New York. It was authored by 50 organizations over Zoom during the pandemic. It offers a vision and a paradigm shift and a plan for systemic change. Please check it out. It's on powherny.org. And if you can, sign on to the vision. The inspiration for this event came from the roadmap, and it clearly said that we need to invest in community solutions to deal with violence rather than relying just on the criminal justice system. I want to thank Selena Bennett-Chambers of NYSCASA and Joan Gerhardt of NYSCADV for all your work in this area, writing the roadmap, and really putting together the idea and the beautiful panel ahead. Thank you so much. But before I introduce our champion and ally, Attorney General Letitia James, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any problems during this, just email us at info@powherny.org or use the chat box. It'll be in the chat box that you'll find the speaker bios, resources that are being talked about, all sorts of information. And if you have a question, put it in the chat. I want to just say that this is a serious conversation. The content might be disturbing. It will be about sexual violence, intimate partner violence, child abuse. So it will be upsetting. And if you feel that you need to take a break, we hope that you do. And then we encourage you just step away for some self-care. The recording of this event will be available after. Also, if you would like to speak to a professional, there is the hotline. Just want to state that now, and that's 800-942-6906. That's the New York State Hotline for Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence. And lastly, we have some interpreters here to help so that everyone can access this information. And there should be English captioning, Spanish captioning, and translation. And then we are supposed to have an ASL interpreter. Go to the chat, and then you will find the instructions there. So now let's get to the program. PowHer is so proud today to sponsor today's event with New York State Attorney General Letitia James, who is the hardest working and most tenacious elected official that we know. Her drive for excellence and for action is how she became the 67th Attorney General for the state of New York, the first woman as Attorney General, and the first woman of color to have a statewide office. We got to know Letitia James from her work as the public advocate. And before that, when she was in the city council representing District 35 in Brooklyn. But it's her compassion and her passion for justice that brings us here today. It's what makes Attorney General so special. She's been a stalwart advocate for women, speaking out on equal pay, opportunity, safety, and every possibility in New York whenever she can. And now on the national stage, she's called for the reauthorizations of the Violence Against Women Act and also retaining the protections of Title IX. So we have an advocate now speaking out in the national field as well. Attorney General Letitia James, she takes on the hard stuff, and that's why she invited us here today to talk about ending intimate partner and sexual violence. Welcome, Attorney General Letitia James.
Thank you and good morning. And I want to thank you, Bev, for all that you have done over the years, lifting up women. I've known you for a very long time, and you have taught me everything that I know. You've taught me about tenacity and speaking truth to power and standing up and representing the interest of women who unfortunately oftentimes are left out in the sunshine of opportunity. So thank you for all that you have done. And I want to thank all of the wonderful organizations who are here today. Thank you for forming and joining this important conversation to re-envision how we can end gender-based violence in New York. And I'm grateful to the groups that are represented here today for their work and their advocacy on this issue. PowHer New York, New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault, the Center for Court Innovation, Just Beginnings Collaborative, Steps to End Family Violence, and Spring Up. And I want to thank all of you. Today's conversation is about exploring solutions to end gender-based violence that support survivor autonomy, healing, and accountability. Unfortunately, the issue of gender-based violence is far too prevalent. 1 in 3 women experience some form of physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And women of color are particularly impacted by gender-based violence. Over 40% of Black women have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner. Black women report experiencing violence at a rate 35% higher than reported by their white sisters. And about 30% of Latina women have experienced violence from an intimate partner. And 21 to 50% of Asian American Pacific Islander women have also reported experience intimate physical or sexual violence. We also know that gender-based violence is not just a woman's issue. It's an issue that impacts everyone. And gender-based violence is also experienced by men as well as by those who do not fit the gender binary, with the non-binary and trans community especially vulnerable. 1 in 4 men have experienced violence from an intimate partner, and almost half of all transgender people have experienced sexual assault in their lifetime. And too many transgender people, unfortunately, die as a result of sexual assault and sexual violence. This is an issue that cuts across race, gender, class, zip code, and has become especially problematic during COVID-19, as all of us have endured for a year social isolation and being locked inside the door of homes that unfortunately have become torture chambers for some women. Here in New York, we know that domestic violence became another epidemic during the pandemic. The stay-at-home orders led to a dramatic increase in domestic violence incidents across the state. Many organizations saw a surge in calls to their hotlines and visits to their website, especially as many people were cut off from access to in-person services. This conversation today is so important because we know there is a need to address gender-based violence and explore new solutions to achieve justice and accountability. Attitudes and responses towards gender-based violence have shifted dramatically in my lifetime, from being seen as a private and family matter, or just the way things are, to individuals who were told to mind their own business, to now being understood as a national, even a global issue that requires a holistic approach, from education to counseling to privacy and to legislation, and that we are each other's brothers and sisters' keeper, and that we have to look out for one another, and that it's okay and we give you license to be nosy, and to report sexual and physical violence when you witness it or see it or suspect it in your community, on your block, in your building. In 2019, the state legislature passed the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, which reduced sentencing for victims who commit crimes against their abusers in self-defense. The legislature also passed a bill expanding the definition of domestic violence to include forms of economic and financial abuse. And just this past January, the state announced a comprehensive package to combat domestic violence by proposing to allow courts to require abusers to pay for damage to their housing, moving expenses, and other housing costs. It reminds me of a case that where I represented a young woman when I was a public defender. It was one of my last cases as a public defender, a young woman who unfortunately was abused for a very, very long time and ultimately took matters in her own hands because her house was not her home and she was not safe. Ultimately, we were successful, but after that experience, she was so vulnerable, and it led me again to run for office and to address the issues of victims of domestic violence and ensure that victims now can become survivors and that pain can be transformed into purpose. You know, these continued efforts to protect the rights and resources of survivors are critical, including the work many of you have been doing to advocate for domestic violence survivors to be able to keep their election registration information confidential. And while New York State has taken important legislative actions, it is important that we explore other potential restorative justice and community accountability practices outside of the law and policy. The bottom line is we still have a lot of work to do in the state of New York and beyond. And there may be multiple ways to repair harm caused by gender-based violence and to hold perpetrators of violence accountable. The pandemic has been a reckoning and has made us rethink how we approach many societal issues, including gender inequality and racial inequality and housing issues and economic issues. And we must all recognize that, again, this is not a woman's issue, but a societal issue, and that all of us must be at the table, including survivors. We must harness this opportunity to reconsider the status quo and explore new approaches and solutions, including to address gender-based violence, and that we cannot return to the same old ways. We cannot return to normalcy. We've got to rethink and reimagine how we are going to return as we see the light at the end of the tunnel. I want to express my support and admiration to those who have spoken out as survivors of gender-based violence. I admire you and thank you for your strength, and I lift you up. It is not an easy thing to do. For those of you who have spoken out, and I and countless others, we stand with you. And for those of you who have not spoken out, I stand with you too. And I give you strength, and I give you my prayers. And I allow all of you to stand on our shoulders. There is no one right way for survivors to heal. There may be no one right way to seek justice. Every survivor has a different story, but your story must be told, and it must be heard by others so that others can no longer suffer in silence. And what is important is that we as allies, that we center survivors and prioritize their needs. My office will always be an ally in this work, from defending the rights of survivors against violence and abuse to working with organizations to ensure survivors can access the resources and supportive services they need, and attorneys that they need as well, and attorneys who will stand up for justice and who will fight for them, just as I did for that young girl when I was a public defender. We must continue to work together to end all forms of violence and push for a more just society where everyone, regardless of gender identity, is seen, valued, and treated with respect. And to end my story, I saw that young girl most recently. She's married now with children, and she's living a wonderful life. Again, I thank all of you for your work to support survivors and to end gender-based violence across New York State. This conversation is critically important, and I stand with you today and every day in support of survivors. And I hope that your story will be told and that your life, again, will begin and end in happiness. Thank you and have a blessed day.
Wow, thank you, Attorney General James, for those thoughtful comments and for supporting the effort to re-envision how we respond to sexual and intimate partner violence by rethinking the status quo. You raised so many interesting points, certainly your longstanding commitment to support survivors, your comments regarding how gender-based violence affects everyone, not just women, particularly resonated with me. And we'll certainly be thinking about all of the issues you raised as we explore ways to meet the needs of all survivors. My name is Joan Gerhardt. I am the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. NYSCADV is the Information Clearinghouse and Resource Center on Domestic Violence for the state of New York. We represent the more than 100 primary purpose domestic violence agencies in the state, and I'm thrilled to be with all of you today. NYSCADV believes that all people have the right to a life free from sexual and domestic violence, and a right to a life free from oppression. We recognize that race, sex, and sexual orientation, gender identity, nationality, and disability-based oppressions intersect with one another. And we know these intersections disproportionately affect Black and Indigenous communities, women, the LGBTQ and trans community, and other marginalized people. These oppressions permeate our institutions, our schools and universities, our courts and criminal justice system, and our government. It's the reason why more people of color are arrested, are incarcerated, and why more people of color who say they are victimized aren't believed when they seek help. Our movement has long worked with the criminal justice system, including police, as one response to sexual and domestic violence. But since the time this infrastructure was created more than 40 years ago, many advocates and activists have asked how this focus on criminalization has impacted survivors. For example, activist and researcher Mimi Kim has asked the core question: why and how did the violence against women movement, an anticipatory social movement, choose criminalization as a dominant strategy? An author and grassroots organizer, Mariam Kaba, has said that while framed as neutral, decisions about what kinds of conduct to punish and how much are very much a choice, guided by existing structures of economic and social inequality based on race, gender, sexuality, disability, and poverty, among others. During the last 4 decades, many advocates and survivors have been asking what it means to hold someone accountable for the harm they cause to another, to consider who is usually involved in this accountability process, and more importantly, who should be involved. This time last year, following the George Floyd murder, NYSCADV and our sister coalition, the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault, signed on to the Moment of Truth letter. It acknowledged our historic failure to recognize and sufficiently consider the experiences of BIPOC survivors, as well as those survivors who identify as LGBTQ+ and trans. We have not, as a movement, sufficiently attended to other community-based pathways to achieving safety. The letter challenges advocates to balance its longstanding work with the criminal justice system with other impactful, collaborative, community-based approaches, which is what led PowHer New York, NYSCASA, and NYSCADV, and the Attorney General's office to convene this event today. We have a responsibility to appreciate the spectrum of what safety means to survivors in all communities, and to frame our work with the understanding that many victims of sexual and domestic violence will not turn to the criminal justice system for a response. Certainly several domestic violence programs and rape crisis centers across New York State are implementing innovative, accessible, and culturally responsive programs that address a broader range of survivors' needs. You'll be hearing from representatives of some of these programs today, but we know many survivors are not able or willing to access these services. So we must do more to rethink, revision, and reimagine our delivery of services. While we will continue to support survivors whose lived experience intersects with the criminal justice system, we recognize the opportunity to engage in more ambitious change, and we welcome conversations about how we will work collectively to address these complex issues. We are in this together, facing challenging truths, making hard choices, and developing new strategies and new responses to all forms of gender-based violence. This is no easy task, yet it is our collective responsibility to build a world in which every individual is valued. I am so excited that today's panel of experts will share with us their wisdom and experiences as survivors and advocates, to provide insight on how we might, as a movement, embrace transformational change and unite together to seek justice and support ways for all survivors and all communities to heal. I'd now like to introduce Selena Bennett-Chambers from NYSCASA, who will be introducing our panelists. Selena.
You're on mute, Selena.
Okay, sorry everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Attorney General James, Bev, and Joan for your remarks. As aforementioned, my name is Selena Bennett-Chambers, and I'm the Policy Director at the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault. You can find my bio in the chat. The New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault is dedicated to advancing civil and human rights, eliminating gender-based violence, and to dismantling the systems of oppression that allow sexual violence and other forms of violence to exist and persist. NYSCASA has over 80 member programs across the state of New York who offer support services to survivors of sexual violence. And I'm very excited about the conversation we are about to embark on today. Before we get started, I want to offer some framing. We will be hearing from 4 dynamic panelists who will highlight the importance of community-based approaches to violence prevention and intervention. They will also underscore the importance of building communities that can prevent violence, respond to violence or harm when it does happen, and support healing. This is a space for us to listen, grow, and learn about ways we can be supportive. So please open your hearts and minds to receive what will be shared here today. Also, please remember to take good care of yourself. This will be recorded if you need to step away. I also want to share 2 quotes with you all today. One quote is directly from the Moment of Truth letter, which will be shared in the chat. And the other quote is from Mia Mingus, who is a writer, educator, and trainer for transformative justice and disability justice. You'll find more information about her in the resource list that we'll be providing after the conclusion of this webinar. Her work is amazing, as well as many of the other folks whose work is a part of that resource list. I think these quotes are relevant because one speaks to the world we are trying to co-create, and the other quote speaks to the ways many of us have been actually practicing transformative justice without even realizing it. So from the Moment of Truth letter, a better world is within reach. It is being remembered and imagined in Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities around the world. And it is calling us to be a part of it. In this world, all human beings have inherent value, even when they cause harm. People have what they need: adequate and nutritious food, housing, quality education, and healthcare, meaningful work, and time with family and friends, and all sentient beings are connected, including Mother Earth. And a quote from Mia Mingus. Transformative justice was created by and for many of these communities. Example, Indigenous communities, Black communities, immigrant communities of color, poor and low income communities, communities of color, people with disabilities, sex workers, queer and trans communities. It is important to remember that many of these people in the communities have been practicing transformative justice in big and small ways for generations, trying to create safety and reduce harm within the dangerous conditions they were and are forced to live in. For example, undocumented immigrant women in domestic violence relationships, disabled people who are being abused by their caretakers and attendants, sex workers who experience sexual assault or abuse, or poor children and youth of color who are surviving child sexual abuse have long been devising ways to reduce harm, stay alive, and create safety and healing outside of state systems, whether or not these practices have been explicitly named as transformative justice. And with that said, I'm excited to introduce our first panelist, Stas. Nastassja Stas Schmiedt is a non-binary Black storyteller, organizer, healer, and imaginatrix rooted in Denver, Colorado. In 2013, Stas and their partner Lee Roth co-founded Spring Up, a collective of facilitators, artists, coaches, and care workers who practice and teach the liberatory arts. Spring Up cultivates a culture of consent and liberty for all through storytelling, transformative justice, and popular education. You can learn more about Spring Up, a Blue Light Academy, or support their work at patreon.com/cultivate consent. So with that being said, Stas, my first two questions for you are, can you briefly define transformative justice, restorative justice, and retributive justice? And can you also tell us more about the work that Spring Up does around sexual violence and intimate partner violence?
Thank you so much for that introduction and for all of the framing that was shared by everyone on the beginning of the call. I'll say I'm a little bit in my feels. Like, I think that those stats for me are real people. They're my life. They're the people around me. And so I want to invite us to just take a couple collective breaths and just sit with the reality of the context that was shared with us at the beginning here. So I'll just guide us, just breathe in. And you can just sigh out. One more. So I'm really happy to be here with you all today. And I think that this is a really unique and pivotal moment. That moment of Truth Letter, I think, really impacted a lot of us. I want to give a shout out to Nan Stoops and to all of the advocates who put so much work into creating something that I think was a long time coming. And to answer your question, the answer to what is transformative justice is both a very short, very simple thing, and also a very complex, thing that's rooted in the work of so many people around the world. But I think at its core, there are a few core components. One is that transformative justice is about addressing harm through accountability and healing. And you've heard a lot of people talk about this so far already. Healing doesn't have a prescriptive destination. There's not one way of achieving healing. But I think that at its core, it's about giving survivors the tools, the support, and the community that they need to follow their healing journey, whatever that means to them. And then I think it's also about accountability. And I think accountability is distinct from punishment. Accountability is a personal skill that we all need to cultivate to be able to acknowledge the harm that we've done and make repair. And I think that that's something that people have really low expectations of within a society and within a system that really disincentivizes people being honest about the harm that they've done. They get the messages that if they acknowledge that they've done harm, that they're all of a sudden someone that no one can ever speak to or engage with. And while survivors have every right to have boundaries, to say, I don't want to be in community or in relationship with this person anymore, and that is completely fair, that it is up to us as a community to decide how we're going to work through the harm that's happened in a way that is fundamentally believing in people's humanity and their ability to grow and change and their ability to live and their ability to be free. And I think that we don't have the opportunity to see what accountability could look like because of the degree that our incentives make it so that it's really not a good idea for most people to acknowledge that they've done harm. And so how can we shift the way that we understand harm, considering that we're all socialized into systems of oppression? No one of us is above harm. And I think that the types of harm that we're talking about here are a lot more serious and a lot more intense than a lot of harm that we see in our society. But the reality is that all of us were socialized into romantic norms of coercion. All of us were socialized into capitalism. I'm probably speaking too quickly. Let me slow down. I have a tendency to speak very quickly. But I think that it's up to us to think about our children, to think about the people in our lives, and to think about what messages did we all hear that contribute to the prevalence of this issue in our society. The reality is that, the police and the state don't have the capacity to respond to the scope of harm that we're seeing in our communities. Those numbers that the Attorney General shared at the beginning, even if all of those were addressed by the state, we would not have the capacity to actually support and engage in the degree that I think those things need. I think that RAIN did a study that had that out of every 1,000 assaults, 230 are reported to the police, 9 cases are referred to prosecutors. Such a small portion of the harm that we're seeing in our communities is even being responded by the state, when we know that criminal justice is the primary kind of strategy that people have been taking. So I think what that brings up is, it is actually on us as communities, it is on us as people in relationship to see it as our issue to address, to see it as our responsibility to hold these conversations with our children, with our peers, with our neighbors, with our students. And so transformative justice at its core is about relationships. It's about the community. While punitive justice is much more about the rule that was broken, right? When the state gets involved, the reason is because a law was broken or a rule was broken. In transformative justice, it's more about the relationship that was broken, the relationship that was harmed, the community that was impacted, and what is necessary for us to come together and shift those norms, right? I think that transformative justice specifically as a response is also about addressing root causes. It's not just about individual cases, it's about understanding what contributes to this degree of prevalence in our society. And as a result, what we call transformative organizing, the work that many of us, I believe, do to try to shift norms of poverty, to have increased access to housing, to have increased access to healthcare, all of those things contribute to the prevalence of violence in our society. And so creating conditions of abundance and support also contribute to preventing that from happening in the first place. Transformative justice within an abolitionist framework is sometimes understood to be about what we don't want. We don't want the state to respond. We don't want certain things. And I think that's fundamentally a misunderstanding. For us, it is about imagining a world in which all of us have the skills and believe that it is our responsibility to address harm amongst ourselves. It's about imagining a different world, imagining a different way of being in which the ways that we take care of ourselves and each other are validated and are supported. And I think that, the reality is that it is difficult for the state to do transformative justice when transformative justice is specifically about not having outside intervention. However, I think that the state, and I think anyone who's doing advocacy work, can learn from some of the fundamental principles of transformative justice, like healing and accountability, as well as harm reduction, which is something that was mentioned in the quote that Selena shared. And I wanted to share a little bit more of a definition of harm reduction from the WHO's Security Toolkit by Lara Brooks and Miriam Kaba, who was mentioned earlier. It says harm reduction is a philosophy of living, surviving, and resisting oppression and violence that centers self-determination and non-condemning access to an array of options. And so I think thinking about what are the ways that people can access options is something that I think is fundamentally a transformative approach that people can integrate. And then finally, you asked what restorative justice is. I think that restorative justice can be institutionalized. There are a lot of programs internationally that can be looked at as examples of restorative practices, but I do think that here in the United States, it's really important that we recognize the indigenous roots of most restorative justice practices and really come into right relationship with the indigenous communities in our state and in our communities. And then just to close, what Spring Up does, how we engage in this, is we do prevention through consent education, and we respond to sexual and gender-based violence, which for us is the violence of the gender binary that impacts all of us through transformative justice. We practice liberatory popular education with the public, including on our online school platform, Blue Light Academy. And we really do the best that we can to increase the skills and support systems of people who are doing this work, centering both survivors and people who have done harm and who are trying to work through accountability. We do this with our grassroots community on Patreon, which I shared a link to, which you can join to support our work and continue to learn from us. We hold healing circles, we hold accountability circles, we do free community resources around healing, like our upcoming Resilience and Revitalization zine that includes contributions from over 15 community members who are young, queer, trans, of color, and incarcerated folks, talking about what they do in their lives to move towards a vision of healing, abolition, and support. And so that's what we do. That's what I'm happy to speak more about, and I'm really, really happy to be here with you all today.
Thank you so much, Stas, for the work that you do and for the work that this full Spring Up team does to create a world that is rooted in ongoing consent, liberation, community accountability, and care. We are so excited to be sponsoring a transformative justice class offered by Spring Up this summer, and we truly appreciate you and all the work that you do. More information can be found about Spring Up on the resource list document that will be sent out. So with that said, I'm very pleased to introduce our next panelist, Hailey. Hailey Nolasco is the Director of Community-Based Violence Prevention at the Center for Court Innovation. In both her personal and professional life, she has worked to think outside of carceral systems to respond to and prevent community violence. She has worked to develop and now leads RISE, a citywide program supporting the New York City crisis management system and communities most impacted by the intersection of gun and intimate partner violence. Excuse me. Hailey believes that approaches to public safety must be community-centered, survivor-informed, and holistic, rooted in principles of accountability and transformative change. Hailey, can you please tell us more about RISE and the work you do, and why are programs like RISE so important?
Thank you, Selena. And I just wanted to thank all of the panelists that are on here today. I'm truly honored to be here today. So RISE, I'm really excited to let everybody know a little bit more about this program. So RISE works to transform responses to intimate partner violence across New York City in a host of different ways. And one way that Selena was just mentioning is addressing its intersection with gun violence. So we work in areas throughout New York City that have high levels of gun violence, but unfortunately, those areas also have very high rates of intimate partner violence as well. So we are part of an extension of the New York City crisis management system that has the cure violence model at the core. And we are offering supports to 23 sites throughout New York City in those areas that I just mentioned that have high rates of both gun violence and intimate partner violence. And these sites are staffed by credible messengers, trusted community members who are focused on identifying and engaging those who are most likely to cause or experience gun violence. So for RISE, it's very great for us to be able to work with these organizations, because if we really want to be intentional about ending gun violence, we can't work in a silo, and we have to understand that intersectional violence leads to gun violence. So being able to work with these community-based organizations that are really on the ground to be able to meet people where they're at in these neighborhoods, to be able to shift perspective, shift norms, and also allow for the exchange of meaningful resources. So we really begin by also engaging these individuals with the knowledge and resources that they need. So we also offer technical assistance and training for when our partners are out there in community, they're able to identify and be able to offer supports that are IPV related, and also be able to connect us to any referrals that may be needed from community residents. Another way that we work in really transforming how we're responding to intimate partner violence is engaging community to develop new strategies to be able to develop and support healthy relationship norms. So really wanting to change those mindsets that tolerate IPV. And I believe that the Attorney General mentioned earlier that notion of minding your business, right? So we are working in community so people can know, like, no, we don't have to mind our business. We can have this conversation. It is something that usually is a private issue. People don't really want to talk about it, but it's something that should be spoken about. It's not something to be embarrassed about. It happens more often than not. We all cause harm in different ways. We all experience harm in different ways. So it's important that we talk about it to be able to have healthier relationships. We also amplify community norms that foster healthy relationships too. Like, let's not only talk about the bad, but let's normalize the good parts of a relationship, right? So we do community activations, pop-ups, community workshops, community conversations. We're about to start a host of community conversations at barbershops coming up towards the end of June. We offer healing circles, and we also have a lot of community campaigns. Recently, we activated storefronts. We also had billboards in every borough where we just had quotes from community residents talking about what's the best relationship advice you've ever received, and really just like trying to put as much of that positive messaging out in community, because respecting your partner, having boundaries, listening to one another, these are the norms that should exist in our relationships. And also engaging. Another really important part of our work is really engaging people that cause harm and really working with them so that they can begin to take accountability and begin to change their behavior. So we work with them voluntarily. We're not a mandated program, and we navigate them in understanding their behavior's impact on others and also themselves, because they're also affected by their behavior. Helping them navigate those uncomfortable feelings that come with becoming accountable. Being accountable or becoming accountable isn't an easy process, even for, small things, right? Where it's just like, did you take out, and this is, a small example, but it's just like, maybe I forgot to do something that I was told to do. And I'm like, oh, I have to be accountable for that. And, maybe I don't want to talk about it, or even just saying, oh yeah, I kind of messed up. It's hard on a small level. So I can only imagine when we're causing harm on a larger level, how difficult it is to begin to unpeel those layers and begin to become accountable. Um, and,
Excuse me,
helping them
Hailey,
navigate those uncomfortable feelings.
we need you to
I'm
slow
sorry,
down. We're just having trouble with the sound, so just slow down a little bit.
no worries. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Um, and working to figure out why these individuals have caused harm in the first place. So peeling back those layers, how did you cause harm? Why did you cause harm? Did you act outside of your beliefs or values that you have? What's happened to you? Because we believe that the first time somebody causes harm is not the first time that they've also experienced harm as well. And just lastly, just to talk about why programs like RISE are important, is that it's something different. It's not where we're looking outside of carceral approaches. We want to be community led, and we understand that there's other ways to, be able to work around this issue and responding to it. A lot of the current approaches to addressing intimate partner violence has supported many people towards safety, but we're seeing that rates of IPV have remained stagnant, and has even increased in a lot of areas. So there's a growing need for community-based approaches, which are not reliant on criminal legal responses. And let's be real, this is a very nuanced issue. So true justice gives people agency. Not everybody that is a survivor or is experiencing intimate partner violence wants to call police. Are there some people that do want to pursue traditional forms and go that route? Absolutely. And if that's something that they want to do, we understand that. But that's not everybody's situation. There are many people that just maybe they want to be separated in a healthy way and just want the abuse to stop and for that individual to get the support that they need. And then there's other folks that want to stay in their relationship, and that's a real thing. So it's, how do we keep those individuals safe if they do want to stay together, while also safety planning for them both at the same time, and being able to support those individuals that do want to remain together but just want transformative support and just want the abuse to stop. And lastly, I'll just say that it's very important to have organizations like RISE, because we understand that relying on criminal legal systems has not been a safe or effective option because of the historical harm these systems have also caused, especially for survivors that that's survival becomes criminalized. So that's really important for us to also know that as well. So we understand that many people don't always call hotlines or services, and then most people really reach out to their networks and people that they know. So that's why it's important for us to be able to equip community residents in the tools that they can utilize if somebody does come to them needing support or saying that they want help with respect to intimate partner violence. And I hope that I did slow down a little bit. I know I could talk at length, but I'll end it right there. But RISE is it's a community-centered program. We're survivor informed, and we're really rooted in principles of safety and accountability and transformative change for the folks that we support. So thank you.
Hailey, thank you. Thank you and your full team for the work that you do around the intersection of intimate partner violence and gun violence. We appreciate the work you do to educate your community about healthy relationships, gender equality, and intimate partner violence prevention. We also appreciate the work you do to help support people who commit intimate partner violence to understand the impact of their behavior, take responsibility for it, and to work on healing and making amends so that they don't continue to inflict harm upon others. And we appreciate you and the full RISE team for all the work you do. More information about RISE can be found on the resource list document that will be shared after this webinar. And so that said, I'm delighted to introduce our next panelist, Ann Patterson. For 28 years, Ann has worked in community with survivors of intimate partner violence in an effort to raise awareness of the epidemic of violence against women, educate others about domestic violence, and transform the rhetoric in institutions that sustain gender-based violence. Ann is a licensed social worker who has worked across the country in multiple domestic violence shelters, briefly within the family regulation system, and extensively within the criminal legal system. For the past 8 years, Ann has been the Senior Vice President of Steps to End Family Violence, Rising Ground, which provides holistic, healing-centered, anti-oppressive clinical advocacy and supportive services to survivors of intimate partner and other forms of gender-based violence. STEP supports survivors across the lifespan with a unique emphasis on elevating the narratives of survivors who have been criminalized for their efforts to survive and or resist harm while working intentionally to dismantle the systems of dominance and oppression that sustain gender-based violence, specifically white supremacy and cis heteropatriarchy. Ann is the co-chair of the Downstate Coalition for Crime Victims, a member of the Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence Advisory Council, and a member of the New York State Office of the Victim Services Advisory Council. And so with that said, just want to share a couple statistics. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, nearly 60% of people in women's prisons nationwide, and as many as 94% of some women's prisons populations, have a history of physical or sexual abuse before being incarcerated. And according to Insight, which is a network of radical feminists of color organizing to end state violence and violence in our homes and communities, women of color and low-income women are disproportionately affected by mandatory arrest policies for domestic violence. Of survivors in New York City study who had been arrested along with the person who abused them, a dual arrest case, or arrested as a result of a complaint lodged by the person who abused them, so a retaliatory arrest case, 66% of the folks were African-American or Latina, and 43% were living below the poverty line, and 19% were receiving public assistance at that time. And so with that being said, we understand that STEPS was founded by the legendary Sister Mary Marney in 1986 after she convened a gathering of women incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Women's Correctional Facility who testified to their stories of abuse and their that relationship to criminal charges. And so, Ann, can you speak to us more about the Criminalized Survivors Program you have at your organization, how survivors actually become criminalized, and what can be done to address this issue?
Certainly can, Selena. Thank you so much. I am in awe and inspired to be part of this community, and I'm sitting here basking in their collective brilliance. And I thank you, Selena, very much for saying Sister Mary Nerney's name. All that we do at STEPS, we try and do in an effort to honor her legacy. And as you said, Sister Mary spent a tremendous amount of time in conversation with women who are incarcerated at Bedford Hills and Taconic correctional facilities, where she learned that women's pathways to prison are paved by their attempts to survive and to keep themselves and their families alive. Born out of that vision and in those conversations, we created what we call our Criminalized Survivors Program. And it's very intentionally called the Criminalized Survivors Program. Although we are an alternatives to incarceration program, we think it is vital to put survivorship at the center of an alternatives to incarceration program. So that is a team of 8, Patrice, Natalia, Andrina, Angie, Allison, Jackie, Marion, and Julia, a team of activist clinicians, advocates and activists who provide holistic support to survivors of gender-based violence who have been criminalized. And thank you, Selena, for lifting up those statistics from the ACLU and from the Inspiring Insight, especially because this is an area of study that is intentionally limited. Because when we talk about the criminalization of survivorship, when we talk about who is caged in our jails and our prisons, it challenges the dominant narrative about who we incarcerate in this country. Another study to bring up, it was done by the Vera Institute for Justice called Overlooked: Women and Jails in an Era of Reform. And what they found was that 86% of women in jail are survivors of sexual violence. 86%. So when we think about the people who are in jails or in prisons, they look almost indistinguishable from the people who are in domestic violence shelters, from the people who pass through the doors of family justice centers, because those people are one and the same. Selena asks, what leads to the criminalization of survivorship? And it brings me back to Attorney General James's words when she was talking about a young woman that she was defending when she was a defense attorney, that the woman was forced to take matters into her own hands. And all of us will be pushed to take matters into our own hands when the systems that are, quote unquote, designed to promote our wellness and safety fail us completely. Well, the criminalization of survivorship is cross-cutting, and I think that is important to name that as a reality. We know that, like all criminalization, it is heavily racialized. We know that BIPOC communities are hyper-surveilled by police and law enforcement. We know that BIPOC communities are over-policed, and as a consequence of that, Black and Brown, Indigenous, Asian Pacific Islander, and other survivors of color are disproportionately targeted for criminalization. We also know that when Black and Brown survivors engage in the most human of acts, the acts to keep ourselves alive, and the primal urge to protect our children, that those acts of survival are perceived as vengeance. They're perceived as revenge, and they're not seen for what they are, the deepest enactment of our own humanity. Nothing is more human than preserving our lives, and I think even nothing is more human than preserving the lives of our children. But when that survivorship, that act of survival, especially when it is enacted by Black and Brown survivors, is not perceived in that way because of the toxicity and the insidiousness of white supremacy and systemic and structural anti-Blackness. We don't see these acts of survival and the acts of structural and systemic failing. We see them as acts of revenge. We see them as acts of violence. That's how survivors are criminalized. When systems fail them, and when dominant messages and structures and systems ignore or erase their survivorship, and it's not seen, and acts of survival are seen as not what they are. We also know that survivorship is criminalized when our basic needs are not met. We don't have access to safe and nutritious food. We don't have access to meaningful healthcare. We don't have access to vibrant and play-based early childhood education. We don't have access to true opportunity to be in playful, abundant, and joy-drenched community with one another. Then we see the criminalization of all sorts of behavior, but we also see the criminalization of the survivorship of survivors of gender-based violence. So what do we do about this? What do we do to disrupt the criminalization of survivorship? I think there's lots of things that we can do. I think we challenge these antiquated notions of who are victims and who are offenders. And everyone who has preceded me in this conversation has elevated that. Every one of us has the capacity to survive harm. Every one of us has survived harm. Every one of us has the capacity to cause harm. And likely every one of us has caused harm. So that means every living person lives at the intersection of both causing and surviving harm. We need to hold that to be true. We need to challenge these notions that some people are good, that some people are bad, that some people are victims, that some people are offenders, and note the fact that we all live at the intersection of those two. We need to diversify the chorus of voices of survivor voices that we listen to. Disproportionately, policies and practices are informed by the voices of white, cis women survivors. We need to diversify that chorus because we know there are so many other chorus of survivor voices. We need to complicate, as I noted before, this narrative about who is criminalized, who is detained, who is caged, and who is incarcerated. As I said before, the population of people who are detained and incarcerated in jails and prisons are virtually indistinguishable from the people who are living in our domestic violence shelters, who are passing through the doors of our family justice centers, who are making calls to domestic violence hotlines. We also need to divest in traditional approaches to public safety. We need to reinvest in radical things that we know create the conditions for peace. And if all this feels too overwhelming, we need to look inward because that is available to absolutely every single one of us. And I'm speaking now very candidly and pointedly to my fellow white people. We need to look at how we are complicit in the hyper surveillance and the over policing of BIPOC survivors. We might be more than complicit in that. We might be actively contributing to that. We need to look at how we are working to challenge the internalized white superiority that so many of us, that I most certainly grapple with, how it lives within us and how it impacts our perception of BIPOC survivors and how it impacts our perceptions about this, the systems that respond to survivorship. And we also have to look as white people, what we are willing to give up for the unearned privilege that has been given to us by our whiteness. And what are we doing every day to give up something that we have not earned? So if we feel overwhelmed by the promise of defund and reinvest, by the possibility of abolition, if we're too overwhelmed by that, then we can look inside. And it's our responsibility to do that hard internal work to cultivate the habit and the ritual of extinguishing the white supremacy that lives within us as white people, so that we can really create a condition and a community that is deeply rooted in peace and love for one another. Thanks.
And thank you. Thank you so much for those words and reflections. Thank you. And thank you for the work that your organization does to support criminalized survivors. Thank you for raising awareness about the direct link between intimate partner violence and criminalization, and for the legal advocacy and court accompaniment you provide to survivors who are detained at Rikers, as well as those in community facing court involvement. And in addition to that, thank you for sharing a resource from Survived and Punished. We know far too many survivors have been criminalized, and we support and appreciate Survived and Punished's work too, to support and free criminalized survivors. More information about Survived and Punished and steps to end family violence, Rising Ground, can be found on the resource list. And so with that being said, I am thrilled to introduce our fourth panelist, Luz Marquez Benbow is an adult survivor of childhood sexual abuse, incest, and rape. Founder of the International Alianza de Mujeres Negrx, a survivor network of Black Latinx to advance movement building toward ending child sexual abuse and sexual violence across the Black diaspora and outside the carceral system. Since 1998, Luz has been working within the statewide and national movement to end gender-based violence, to ensure the voices of survivors of color are centered, and developing funding resources within the Violence Against Women Act, known as Culturally Specific Communities of Color Grant Program. Luz, can you tell us more about the work you do to end childhood sexual abuse and other forms of sexual violence, and speak to what healing and justice look like to you?
Thank you. And like many of the other panelists that came before me, I'm thrilled to be here. I'm actually ecstatic to be here because it feels like I'm in a very sort of spiritual realm of my work coming home to New York, which is a state that I love. I am a Black New Yorican. For those of you who are listening, shout out to all of us. And I live in Troy, New York, which is in the capital region. It is the land of the Mohican people. And so I greet you all as a fellow survivor, as a Black diasporic individual, and I'm just happy and thrilled to be here. For the last 5 years, my work has been rooted in amplifying our voices as survivor leaders, especially those of us who represent the Black diaspora. When I mention the Black diaspora, many of us in the US think of Black people as only being folks who represent African American, and definitely we owe a lot of depth and gratitude to the long legacy and history and richness of what it means to be African American or / Black American in the US. But there are also Black folks who represent my homeland of Puerto Rico, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Latin America, as well as Haiti and the rest of the Caribbean. And so when I use the term, and many of us use the term of the Black diaspora, that is what we're referencing, is that we are coming together as groups of people who are descendants of the transatlantic slave trade to speak out, right, about our lives mattering. And for me in my work to end child sexual abuse and gender-based violence, to connect the issues of gender-based violence, of child sexual abuse, to that rich and powerful long legacy of a movement to, for Black liberation. And so much like my siblings throughout the state of New York, like the Black Freedom Project, of course, Me Too, which is embedded right here in New York, I am connected to a long legacy and a rich history of other survivor leaders who are leading the movement for Black lives, who are leading the Black feminist futures, as I think of Paris Hatcher's work. And so it's an exciting moment for many of us who are survivors. I think many people, the Me Too movement resonates with them because it was a watershed moment, to use Tarana Burke's word, where many of us started disclosing on social media, to family, and in our work. But there were many of us who were already doing that long before Me Too sort of came out public, hit the mainstream media, because Tarana was doing that work as well. As I think about the work of you all have mentioned of Insight, and being a 30-something-year-old and going into Insight and finally feeling grounded that as a survivor, I did nothing wrong by not disclosing. And I want to say that again to you all because I need you all to hear that. I, as a little girl from the ages of 7 to 14, did nothing wrong for not telling what happened to me. Because as a little girl, I was navigating what happened to me and what continues to happen to my Black community. At that time, I lived in Harlem, and we could look out the window on a daily basis, and you would see police harming people in my community. You would see and hear the stories of what would happen in the courtrooms. You would see and feel the ways that our communities were being further harmed and separated by the very systems, such as CPS, such as foster care, that are put in place to help us and provide support for us. And then we wonder why the Black community and other communities of color lack trust in those systems. And so for me, I chose, like many other survivors, to stay silent, and I don't regret it. And it is the gift that I got from connecting to sisters at Insight, such as Beth Ritchie, such as Andrea Ritchie, such as Mia Mingus, and some of the people that you mentioned, and others whose names are unknown and known, and the Loretta Rosses, who were telling us that being silent was also about surviving. And that being silent at 7 and 14 was a very different thing than speaking out about it as I sit here now at the age of 54. And I've had over 20 years of therapy, and I've been in this movement and understand both within the system of the mainstream work as it's done, and now as someone who's leading it and within outside of that movement. So to answer your question about how my work is birthed, and I needed to lay that fundamental foundation because I wanted you to know who you're listening to. Because oftentimes people think of us as survivors of being broken people, as people who should not be centered in policy discussions, in discussions such as this. We should always be in these discussions because there's a breadth of shoulders that I stand of survivor leaders who've reckoned with this movement, both within it as a mainstream movement and outside of us, and we will continue. So as a Black Boricua, adult survivor of incest, child sexual abuse, and sexual violence, and I will try to speak slower because both as a Puerto Rican, as a New Yorker, it's a cultural thing for us to talk quickly, but I will try to speak slower for all of the interpreters. But taking a page from the amazing work that Insight has left us and the blueprint that they have given us, as well as my own work of supporting the leadership of women of color at sexual assault coalitions and DV coalitions across this country. And when I think of the culturally specific program, that for 10 years of my life, I walked the halls of Congress to, for the first time in the history of the Violence Against Women Act, develop resources for Black, Latinx, Native, Indigenous, and Asian Pacific Islander communities. That is in 2012, you all. That is in 2012. We've got a lot to reckon with. And so in 2016, I received this wonderful invitation to be part of a Just Beginnings Collaborative Fellowship. Some of you may have heard of this. I'm not sure who has. I'll try to throw the link and the resources in there. It is a group of amazing people who, in collaboration with the Ms. Foundation and the then Novo Foundation, which is very different than the current one, who were thinking and exploring ways of ending child sexual abuse and thinking about it in a way that looked outside of the systems, because the work was just not, the abuse is just not ending. And so how do we figure out ways to end the abuse? We're just responding to the abuse. That is all CPS does. That is all child advocacy programs do. That is all the criminal justice system does. But how do we really, really prevent it? And how do we prevent it centering the very people who've experienced this and their voices? And so for the first time in my work, here I was surrounded by amazing people like Aisha Shahida Simmons, Mia Mingus, Ignacio Rivera, Sujata Baliga, Sonia Shah, Tarana Burke, while she was part of Girls for Gender Equity, Black Women's Blueprint, and the Firecracker Foundation based in Lansing, Michigan. Like for the first time, I'm like, wow, how do we do this? And I'm hearing about restorative justice and transformative justice. I had heard about it before. I'd experienced analysis around it at Insight, but I was never sitting in a conversation where I, as a survivor, can speak to another survivor about how do we mend relationships with our family. I am an incest survivor. My oldest brother, who's 7 years my senior, begins to abuse me as what I can remember at the age of 7. But I'm also protected and saved by my other 2 brothers who saw it and intervened. How do I uplift that story? Because if I had gone to a system and reported, they would have destroyed our family further than the harm that my brother caused, because my other 2 brothers protected me. They stood up for me and they ended that abuse. It didn't end the rest of the abuse that I received by other people in my community up until I was 14, but it ended the abuse in my direct home by 2 other siblings who were also children intervening and giving me the grace to understand what was happening and telling to our older brother that what he did was wrong and that he needed help. The genius of this still lies in my body as I say it to you all. And so what did I do with my fellowship? I, for the first time, and I'm turning 50, felt so emboldened to say, I want to talk to my Black Latinx community, and I want to add our voices to that of the brilliant voices of Black American women, Black immigrant women, and Black Caribbean women, by bringing those of us together from Latin America to talk about an issue that we never, ever, ever talk about. And if we do talk about, it's within this analysis that you have to go to a system. And then if you say to them, but that system harms us, and for us to engage in that rich and complicated, because it's complicated work, discussion of what does it mean to be rooted in healing that is based in our African traditions. What does it mean to be rooted in healing and work that is about social change and organizing to enhance our lives and to mobilize our Black diasporic women and girls and femmes and other gender expansive populations, right? To look at strategies outside of the carceral system, outside of the CPS system, outside of these systems, and to look for mutual aid as supports. Most people think about mutual aid as financial support, but it's much bigger than that. If you can for a moment go back to the time of the Black Power movement, of our Young Lord movement, which is the Puerto Rican independence movement for those of us who are Latinos, of the Asian Guard, which was the socialist movement for the Asian community, and the indigenous social justice movements, we get a breath of what mutual aid supports and systems look like, as well as you get an experience of what healing processes look like before the transatlantic slave trade ever began to bring my ancestors and many of ours collectively into this country against their own bodily will, as well as the genocide of indigenous people. And so that is the work that I am rooted in. That is the work that gives me life. And I owe so much to my collective and my cohort. That fellowship ended in 2019, but Just Beginnings continues to do this work to center survivor leadership, especially those of us from communities of color and for gender nonconforming and trans communities who've been left out or marginalized within the very movement that we help to build. Ruth Wilson Gilmore often says that where communities are cherished, they're all cherished. And where communities are not cherished, or some are cherished, then only some are cherished, which means that many communities are left out to be harmed. And for us as a Black diasporic community, it means us. And we're seeing that in real time. As a little girl growing up in Harlem, this little Black Boricua girl walking through the streets of Harlem, and like many other Black girls, and I want to bring them into this fold, we're often not cherished. Our bodies aren't respected. And we live at this intersection that allows us to be so vulnerable to violence within our families and community. We are further traumatized and experience further violence, and in many ways are killed by the very systems that are supposed to protect us. And we need to yell that out, because that is a pandemic to our lives. My work is about strengthening communities to end such violence, my community as a Black diasporic survivor, and also my local community of the Capital Region, and namely of Troy, where we're building mutual aid supports that are not just about funding, but also about exploring ways where our white allies are showing up to hold our white city governments accountable from when they fail us, and that we as Black communities are coming together to talk about the violence that we experience, whether it's the gun violence, child sexual abuse, sexual violence, and any other forms of violence. We're hosting listening circles with Black girls and youth of color, LGBT youth of color, and we're organizing in our movement for Black lives.
Thank you so much, Luce. That's
Thank you.
amazing.
Thank you, Luce. This is Joan Gerhardt again from NYSCADV, and I want to thank all the panelists. Wow, there was a lot covered, and I'm sure everyone's understanding of the work that you all do has been enhanced, and it's really moving the ball for our movement to think through how we might transform the methods we use to respond to domestic and sexual violence. We have only a few minutes remaining, so I would like to ask all of the panelists to put their cameras on and provide just a few thoughts. Keep in mind, we only have about 6 or 7 minutes on the following. How do we continue this trajectory? What are the next steps? You know, how can we shift to rely on more collaborative and community-based approaches that are tailored to each survivor's unique lived experience and needs? And how can we ensure that all survivors have access to the resources that they need? So I'm not sure who would like to start. Don't be shy.
I could go first. I'll be really brief. I think that one of the most important things is comprehensive sexuality education, consent education that is with youth and with adults. And I think that it can start as early as, you know, when you're learning how to think and speak, and it can go all the way into elder care, which I think is so important. And I think that those are things that often, you know, consent is not just about intimate partner violence. It's also about just how we navigate the fact that there are different power dynamics. People want different things. And I think that that's a fundamental skill to us navigating racial equity and shifting the way that power operates in our society. And so I think that funding and supporting community-based consent education is really, really important. And then I also think that like having access to funds that are actually run by community, where community members are paid to distribute those funds, and there are very, very little strings attached, because I cannot tell you how much time and effort community programs have to put into applying for funding that they don't end up getting. And if you do end up getting it, so much of your time goes into reporting and explaining what you do, or hiring a researcher to explain, you know, data evidence-based practices. And so I think, like, how can we trust the people who are doing this work more, including financially, and including having them make the decisions about where money goes?
Thank you, Stas.
I would like to add, to answer the question about first prevention violence, or how do we address it in the first place. The work of Ignacio Rivera, and we can add that to the resources, comes to mind as one of my cohort members in Just Beginnings. And Ignacio, they use them as a pronoun. They often talk about, we teach kids how to cook, we teach kids how to drive, but we don't teach them the most fundamental thing about our bodies, and how our bodies are sacred, and how we can teach kids when they're roughhousing, you know, to follow along Stas's comment about consent, that you get to say, wait a minute, do you want a rough house? Do we understand what that means? And are there boundaries around what that rough housing looks like? So how does it look to engage a 5-year-old with another 5-year-old and say, wait, stop, let's have a break. I don't want to disrupt your rough housing if that's what you both are agreeing to do, but let's talk about it, because we don't want to harm each other's bodies. I know as a parent, I was so nervous about harming my own child. This is something that we as survivors reckon with in our hearts every single day. I can't tell you how I would break into tears changing my daughter's diaper, because I wanted to make sure I didn't hurt my daughter or any of my children. And so I began to talk about, and I would say it was almost like a prayer for me, but it was also a way of teaching my children from the very first day I'm changing their diaper at the hospital, and the nurse is teaching me to say, this is your body. I am your mom. I am changing you right now. I am cleaning you right now, until you at some point learn the skills to do this yourself. And no one else gets to do this unless you allow them. We can use that language so early, when we're not talking about actual sex or orifices, or we're talking about the beauty and the sacredness of our bodies. And we're giving that back to our children. And so I just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much, Luz. Hailey, I see your mic is off.
Yeah, I was thinking that, and Luz, thank you so much for sharing that. Also, like, even thinking about when I'm with my nieces or my goddaughters, that's exactly how I wash them, shower them, you know, change their diapers. I ask them, and I know someone was like, are you talking to them right now? I'm like, yes, I want them to understand, you know, and it's like, this should be normal. So thank you so much for sharing that, because it's something that I also practice as well. So just definitely wanted to thank you for that. I think that in order to prevent violence from happening, it's really working with integrity, with intention, with love, with patience. And I think that that sometimes gets lost. So really working with that in the front end, always remembering why we're doing what we're doing, really helps to make meaningful connection and helps to really help begin to prevent a lot from happening, and really building upon those supportive networks in community, furthering them, amplifying them, because they already exist. And then to really prevent it from happening, there needs to be a real look at the structural conditions that allow for violence to happen in the first place. Because if everything is working, great, the likelihood of there being violence is going to be very low. When you look at other neighborhoods that are well resourced, I'm sure that things still happen, right? But it doesn't look the same way that it does in other communities, and that's done by design, and it's purposeful. So really looking into intergenerational poverty and educational inequity, displacement, that's a real thing when we're talking about gentrification, inadequate housing, and looking at people as whole individuals, respecting them. And when violence does happen in communities, one thing that RISE does is that we look at what harm was caused to the individual, to the community. We offer the supports to those that were primarily affected, and we walk around, we talk to folks and ask them if they were impacted as well. And then we offer healing spaces, supportive spaces in community for people to come out to and be able to share their feelings and sentiments, and also make that a touch point for additional resources. Because again, to that integrity and being meaningful about our work piece, we have to meet people where they're at so that they can access the services and resources, and also speak to them in a way and offer them resources that, to what Stas was saying, is easy to understand, it's comprehensible, it's in our language. And I'm saying our language because I'm a part of that community. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Hailey. And we have 1 or 2 minutes. Would you like to offer some final remarks?
Nothing more or more brilliantly or beautifully can be said. No, let's go. Yeah.
Well, in our last 5, I would like to turn the floor to Ty Johnson, who is the special advisor to the Attorney General, who's going to close us out today. Ty?
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you for that important and insightful conversation. My name is Ty Johnson, and I am the Special Advisor to New York State Attorney General Letitia James. As AG James said earlier, our office is an ally in this work and is committed to protecting New Yorkers from violence and abuse and supporting survivors as they seek justice and accountability. This conversation has showcased different ways to support survivors. At the Office of the Attorney General, we have a crime victims assistance coordinator who is a social worker and works with survivors by connecting them with different advocacy, supportive, and safety planning services. We refer and connect survivors to appropriate agencies and resources in the community, from therapeutic services to medical services to housing assistance. Our coordinator also assists survivors and their families by guiding them and providing them with emotional support during the traditional criminal justice process, which at times can be traumatizing. We value our relationships with these agencies and organizations across the state and appreciate the opportunity to learn about new resources and opportunities available to ensure survivors have the physical and emotional support that they need to heal from their trauma, and rebuild their lives. If you or someone you know would like to report violence or abuse, from sex trafficking to workplace harassment, you may contact our helpline at 1-800-771-7755. I will also put this number in the chat. Again, that's 1-800-771-7755, or at 1-800-788-9898 for the deaf and hard of hearing. And again, that number is 1-800-788-9898. You may also file a complaint online at our website, www.ag.ny.gov. Again, that's www.ag.ny.gov. Again, the Attorney General and our office are allies and appreciate the strength and courage of all survivors and we continue to stand with you to bring an end to gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ty, for ending with those strong words. We really appreciate the Attorney General's comments that were so deep, and real, and yours as well. And I think this incredible conversation, informing everyone, about what more can be done and what more we need to learn. And knowing the Attorney General, she will take that in and do the very best that New York State can do with that. So I thank you so much. And I want to thank all of the panelists. I really don't even know what to say. This has been such a extraordinary panel. Thank you for your openness, your honesty, your realness, your directness, telling your stories, telling other people's stories. When PowHer started on the road to our roadmap, we wanted to talk about inclusive gender justice. We wanted to include about justices, the crossroads of race, gender, class, and we wanted to talk about paradigm shifts. And this is the kind of work that we are just thrilled to be able to move forward. And I appreciate everyone's partnership. We do it together. So thank you so much. Of course, thank you to the Attorney General, to Ty, Selena, Joan, the interpreters. You worked so hard. We so appreciate that. Behind the scenes, Abby, Grimshaw, Rye Walker, making this whole event move smoothly. To all the groups and all the individuals who are doing this work. This is called re-envisioning. And that is going to take time. That's about the future, right? But we can have impact now. And please look for a follow-up email from PowHer for things that you can do. Comprehensive sex ed was mentioned. It's one of the priorities, and many of the groups that are on this call are working on that. We see that as essential as well. So help us move this work along, share what you're doing. And I hope that our panelists read the chat, because it's just an overwhelming standing ovation for all of you, and we thank you. So everyone have a good and safe day, and we look forward to doing this work together as we move forward. Thank you.